Hi, I'm Connor McClay, and today on The Detail, I'm investigating the state of Hollywood's superhero obsession. DC's latest offering has hit the cinema. It's Joker 2, about the infamous Batman villain in a movie without Batman. Directed by Todd Phillips, with Joaquin Phoenix reprising his role as the title character. Let's take a look and see how it went down.
Did Joker need a sequel? No.
Joker 2 is getting some pretty bad reviews, so here's another one.
What we do know is that the direction that Todd Phillips went with did nothing but insult and offend the numerous fans of the original. So they stayed away already during the opening weekend, courtesy of a bunch of early leaks, and they stayed away in unprecedented numbers.
More like Joker Folia Doo-Doo.
Because it looks like Joker 2's early ticket sales are right on par with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Dysentery and The Flash. Oof.
Not looking good. Joker 2 comes after a controversial but successful first movie based on the backstory of one of the most famous villains of all time, of one of the biggest superheroes.
I'm Batman.
Is DC having its day? Is the genre itself showing the first signs of fad decay, where a trend that has dominated our lives for a good 2 decades is finally on its way out? Or are we merely at the dip of a wave that is going to continue going up and down for as long as movies continue to exist forever and ever? Joining me will be comic scholar Neil Curtis from the University of Auckland, as well as veteran movie reviewer Darren Bevan. Together, we'll be taking a look at the monolithic genre that is superheroes through the lens of the latest entry that some would argue shouldn't even count as such, Joker 2. So, to the Batmobile! Darren Bevan, thank you for coming to the studio today.
My pleasure.
For starters, why don't you tell us about yourself? What do you do?
So I am an independent film reviewer. I've been doing this for maybe, getting on for 30 years now, I think, in various forms, working for companies such as TVNZ, Stuff. Also worked for News Talk ZB as a reviewer for years with Mike Hosking, Jack Tame and Paul Holmes. So I've been around a lot and seen a fair bit as well, it has to be said. It takes a lot to impress me at times.
And what's your current stomping ground?
Currently, I'm an independent film reviewer. I'm working for Women's Day and Women's Weekly as an entertainment writer, but you can also find me online on my own website at Darren's World of Entertainment.
Now, the latest topic of the hour, other than superhero movies in general, has been the new Joker movie.
When I first saw Joker, when I saw you, for once in my life, I didn't feel so alone anymore.
Joker 2, Folie à Deux, am I saying that right?
Folie à Deux.
Folie à Deux. I assume you've seen it.
Yes, I have. I didn't love it as well, unfortunately. I did quite enjoy the first one in its nihilistic tones and vision of what a Joker character could be. But this latest one's just a little bit of an interminable slog in parts, unfortunately.
How does it not hold up?
I think the problem with this one is that it doesn't have as much of a plot to go around. I mean, the title Folie à Deux is a French phrase which means a madness shared by two, and the focus very much is on Joaquin Phoenix's character Arthur Fleck, this sort of outcast, societal outcast in Gotham who he's a failed clown basically and wants to be a stand-up comic, and there are a lot of issues around mental health and general delusions in the character. And in this latest, he's incarcerated after being caught basically executing Robert De Niro's talk show host character when he appeared at the end of the last film, and he's waiting trial. And in this newest one, he meets up with Lady Gaga's self-imposed fellow prisoner who forms this sort of relationship with them, but they seem to have this weird connection that manifests itself in musical numbers. So rather than explaining emotions or talking through feelings, there are plenty of scenes of just musical numbers and old school songs done to dances, like you would see in very much the old Hollywood films. But I don't think the audience was kind of ready for that or looking for that. They were looking for a bit more action rather than something a bit more cerebral. And I think, unfortunately, in parts, a lot of this just kind of drags where it shouldn't do. There's not much of a story around around it. It's set around a trial, and it was very much clear that the first film was self-contained and they weren't going to do another one. But Joaquin Phoenix said he just couldn't leave this character behind. It kept nagging at him, and he felt there was more they could do it. So he met up with the director, Todd Phillips, and that's where they went with this. But I don't think audiences wanted it. I don't think there's enough plot to sustain the 2 hours, 20 minutes of it. And no matter how wonderful and visual and well put together it is, it just doesn't have enough to keep your interest, unfortunately.
And what was the big attraction to the first Joker that made it such an unexpected hit?
I think the idea with the Joker has always been that that character itself doesn't have a definitive origin story. So you could have an idea for Joker and you would be right. I could have an idea for Joker's story and that would be right. So consequently, everyone feels like they have a take on what the Joker could be. I mean, we all know it from that iconic 1980s film with Jack Nicholson falling into the vat of chemicals and emerging with the white face.
Jack is dead, my friend. You can call me Joker. And as you can see, I'm a lot happier.
Or you know it from the 60s TV show with Adam West, where Cesar Romero was covered in white face paint and a very distinctive purple suit.
Come, my puckish partners in plunder. Batman has been outwitted, and the fabulous jewel collection is ours.
They are very definitive images, but to a story that doesn't have a definitive edge itself. So you can take the story anywhere, you can take the idea and concept of Joker anywhere, and that's what I think the first film did. It just took a societal loser, a character who was on the outcast, and said, well, this guy has the potential to shake things up, to affect the system, because he is one of many, many people around the world who are like this. And you don't have to be a criminal mastermind to carry out crime. You don't have to be a criminal mastermind to shake up things in your own world. And they played more to the darker elements and perhaps the mental illness elements of that character, Arthur Fleck, that Joaquin Phoenix played. And I think it sort of worked on that front. And it was a very much a different take on a story that we've seen many times before, but we don't know the actual origin of, because there isn't an official canon origin for fans to obsess over.
It sounds to me like, with the absence of Batman and everything you talked about, the focus of the movie not being supervillains so much as a mental health story of one man's breakdown, did this even need to be the Joker? Could it not have been just an independent story told by itself?
It could have stood alone. It didn't have to be Joker, but Joker sets it up in a world that a lot of people recognise. I mean, I say the Joker to superhero fans, they immediately know who they're talking about. If I say the guy down the street who's slightly awkward and uncomfortable, you don't have any context for that. But I think putting that kind of story in the Joker's world is it immediately flags it up to millions and millions of fans, millions of people who've read the books, comic books, who've heard of, even in passing, of the character. And then you add to that an actor like Joaquin Phoenix, who's very much a distinctive look, is known for fully engrossing himself in these roles and really kind of taking on the character. And he's got an inbuilt audience as well. So it's that kind of kismet and joining of all of these characters, all of the audiences, and all of the potential scope for box office success together.
Aren't people getting a little sick of nostalgia bait at this point, though?
Possibly, although box office would say potentially not. I mean, things come in waves and troughs, peaks and troughs. There has been a backlash against Marvel and the amount of films that they've put out for the same characters. But you'll notice that, there's not been that many series that have dropped on Disney Plus for Marvel characters, or they've concentrated on side characters like the Agatha character played by Catherine Hahn in the current series Agatha All Along. That's a side character that appeared from Vision and Wanda Maximoff's story, and that's become a little bit of a cultural sensation itself, because Marvel's realized we put too much out, we swamped the marketplace, people got tired of seeing the same thing. So they're being a bit smarter. But I think if you can call it nostalgia bait and you can react to it like that, but you have to realize there are audiences for this. And if you're a film executive, that's what you're chasing. It's the bottom dollar. You're chasing the return on investment and the chance to do it. So whether you do nostalgia bait is one thing. It's whether you do it well enough. I mean, like I said, look at Michael Keaton in The Flash. That was a fantastic bit of nostalgia bait. that worked really well, didn't overstay its welcome. They haven't talked about revisiting Michael Keaton-led Batman film, possibly because he's in his mid-70s, but because the idea of it's not too great. But that small dose of Keaton Batman was enough to make people fall in love with the character once again. And I don't think you can ever discount that when it comes to marketing and pitching an idea and going from there. I do very much believe there's a place for new ideas, but I also think the feeling of saturation of IP over so much superhero material had just reached a peak at that time in the 2020s after the COVID pandemic hit. It became comfort viewing, but nothing new was being done with it, and audiences started to react to that and wanted to see different stories.
There was a time when the Western dominated Hollywood. Now you're unlikely to see a new cowboy movie on the big screen in the average year. Are superheroes in the middle of a similar boom that we will one day look back on? Let's look at the cultural side of the world's biggest genre juggernaut.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Neil Curtis. I'm a professor of media and screen studies at the University of Auckland, and I primarily now regard myself as a comics scholar, I suppose.
Oh, what does being a comic scholar involve?
Well, at the moment, it's about working with the Brain Research Centre at the University of Auckland and with the national charity Brain Tumour Support to create 8 comics about brain tumours.
That sounds fascinating. How does comics help with that specific
Well, it's using comics for science communication. We're always trying to find different media with which to inform people, educate people, develop public awareness of things, and increasingly comics are a vehicle to do that. It's an area of what we call graphic medicine, which is the intersection of comics and health.
How much do you study the traditional uses of comics? How much are you into the superheroes and the historical use of them?
Well, very much so. I mean, my background is what you'd call is sort of continental philosophy and political theory, right? And I developed an interest in comics about 15 years ago when I started teaching comics at the University of Nottingham. I then developed a project called Sovereignty and Superheroes, where I was using superheroes as a lens to explore the concept of sovereignty. So I was taking all my political theory and looking at it through a popular culture form. And I wrote a book for Manchester University Press and lots of articles in journals about superheroes. So I did a lot of work on that, but I've sort of left that behind now.
Sovereignty and superheroes, how do those two relate?
I think the classic example would be Batman. If you think about sovereignty is generally defined as a monopoly over violence, right? The state has a monopoly over violence. Superheroes are really a wonderful way of looking at the relationship between law and violence, right? And also the most sovereign moment is when a sovereign announces a state of emergency, right? And of course, superhero universes are permanently in states of emergency, right? And another important aspect of the sovereign is making the distinction between friend and enemy, and of course that's a crucial part of superhero universes. So it was really just exploring, using various different superheroes to explore different aspects of sovereign power.
Have you happened to have seen the new Joker movie?
Yes, I have. I went to see that yesterday. And like the first one, I'm quite mixed in my opinions about it. I think formally, particularly the first one, was fascinated because it sort of looked like almost like an art house movie, right? And I love when directors have a vision for a superhero movie that takes it somewhere else, that pushes what a superhero movie can be. I enjoyed that, and Joaquin Phoenix's performances are excellent. You could talk about the way it was performed, the dialogue, the pacing of the film, general aesthetic, I thought was really interesting. But, of course, in that first film, if we're talking about fantasy, it's very much a sort of incel fantasy. You know, it came out at a particular time when a lot of kind of Trump fans were also, you know, in this sort of manoverse or whatever.
The manosphere.
The manosphere, yeah, whatever they call it. There's some deep-seated misogyny around.
Through all the discourse, it's hard to overlook that both Joker movies and the ongoing Penguin TV series are Batman movies without the Caped Crusader himself showing up.
I have this terrible feeling he's really not coming.
Between these two Joker movies, two Suicide Squad movies, an upcoming Penguin movie, and a cultural obsession with Harley Quinn, we're getting quite a few movies and just media in general focused on like the Batman universe without Batman in it. Do you think there's a reason for that, as it signified something?
I think it's possibly the idea that Batman's origin story has already been told so many times. I mean, we've seen 3 or 4 different versions of the guy whose parents were murdered in an alleyway and who turns to a life of vigilantism to combat the crime in the city that he cares so much about. It's not a new story. It's not told differently anyway. There's nothing new that you can bring to that set linear narrative. But with the other worlds around them, there's scope for much more. There's always scope for another take on Harley Quinn, as you'd seen from the completely contrasting differences between Lady Gaga's performance in these films and Margot Robbie's world as well. I mean, Margot Robbie brought a very colourful, playful, psychotic edge to Harley Quinn, which really resonated with a lot of people. And with this new Penguin TV series that's on at the moment, streaming on Neon over here and elsewhere on HBO Max abroad and worldwide, there's an idea to delve into a world that we've not really seen much before, and that drama itself becomes more of a mobster's take on the story. It's a story of the criminal underworld that Batman operates outside of and around, but little's kind of known other than it's a classic mob setup. So I think there's that kind of idea that really with these stories, they're looking for a way to widen the scope of what's around. You give a sandbox world to other characters and other directors, and suddenly everyone has a different idea of how they play. I mean, if you think about when you were younger, how you played with toys, whether you played with them with your brother or by yourself, I guarantee you that the way you played with them was slightly different to how your brother played with them or your friends played with them. And it's that kind of different prisming of stories and spreading out that makes the main characters identifiable, but the side characters full of much more potential.
Does that make Batman the toy that we've dropped then? Are we moving on from the character in general, or do you think we'll see more of him in future?
I think it'll depend. There's a second Batman film being made, and this Penguin TV series is much a bridging gap between the first one, which came out in 2022, and Matt Reeves' latest, which is due next year. And that's really because, the actors' strikes and the writers' strike postponed that. I think we would have had those out a lot quicker had they not. But I don't think it's that Batman's got boring. I think it's the concept of who plays the Batman has become more interesting than the actual character itself. And I think that's a slightly dangerous thing in terms of how audiences react. They're going more for the casting and seeing whether George Clooney messes it up again or what Robert Pattinson can bring to it.
So where, according to Neil Curtis, does the character go from here?
The modern-day Batman, kind of from the sort of 70s through the 80s, really, they kind of completely refigured him as he's a conservative fantasy. This idea that without these billionaires to come in and save the world, society will fall apart. And what's interesting about the very last film, which was just called The Batman, I mean, they went back to the sort of original name, which included The Batman.
The Robert Pattinson version.
Yeah. Again, it was a trawl through this miserable conservative world where society is weak and violent and needs saving. And yet at the end, there's this really interesting moment where he seems to get that he can't just chase these villains, right? That he actually needs to do something. He needs to help people, and he starts sort of reaching out to people around him and assisting them. And there's a kind of almost like a collective moment towards the end of the film, which I thought, now this is quite interesting. If they're setting up this run on the Batman for him to take a pro-social turn, I think there's room there for the Batman to still be really, really interesting.
Time will tell where Batman in particular and the industry as a whole will go from here, but critics and academics alike can speculate.
My worry is that Hollywood does not have the bravery to do what it could do with superheroes. For example, in the sort of Batman, Joker, Harley universe, you've got a fantastic character like Poison Ivy. She's a sort of villain stroke anti-hero, but she's an eco-warrior. I mean, this is the perfect time for telling Ivy's story. They just don't have the bravery to do it. So I think I don't have that much faith in the future of superhero films because I don't have that much faith in Hollywood. I don't think Hollywood is brave enough to do the quite radical films it ought to be doing. It won't do enough of the pro-social stuff. It's not the films, it's not the genre, it's not the comics right? It's not the concept of the superhero that's lacking. It's the courage of movie executives. That's what's lacking.
Like I say, I think we'll just have less of it. I think the quality is going to slightly improve. I think the fact that marketing campaigns have dropped off a little bit with some of the bigger films, I know there's possibly a feeling that that's due to the writers' strike and the ramifications of that side of it and getting stuff put out there with COVID. That pipe, rather than being continually overflowing, is more of a drip feed now. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think people re-embrace some of the genres that perhaps they've walked away from, and some of the films that they've maybe had enough of, that they'll come back to those characters. Maybe some of that nostalgia bait will prove to be cinematic catnip in many ways. But I think what's going to happen is I think people will start to return to superhero films, and wisely, the studios that make them will realize that by not swamping the marketplace and by carefully curating a content schedule that's very much tailored towards satiating the audiences rather than overflowing them, that'll prove to be the box office gold and the narrative gold that these stories really do need.
As a movie critic, what do you want to see happening in Hollywood?
I just want to see different stories. I mean, I think the thing that I've found over the years and years is just how few original stories get told these days, and how few of them even get made for the big screen. I mean, a lot of the stories are confined to the smaller screen or TVs because no one's willing to take a risk on them. And I would just love to see that flipped around and changed, and maybe you get to the stage where you're like an M. Night Shyamalan who puts out films that have great high concepts. They always flop because they're quite disastrously executed in parts, but at least that guy's out there trying new ideas or trying different things. Each one of those has an individual, unique USP in it. It can't be replicated, and it, in many ways, it perversely chooses not to play to the replication of that genre and that idea. And I think from a critic's point of view, that's a great thing to see, something different being made. And I just wish there was more of those out there than being swamped with standard box office tentpole fare, which admittedly we need to keep the industry going. But after a while, just becomes so sappingly familiar that you just like, please stop and try something different.
Does Joker qualify as one of those new, different movies that you'd like to see?
Yeah, Joker 2 was an interesting idea. I don't think the experiment quite worked as well as it did. And I think with a bit of an expeditious trim and edit here and there, it could have worked as a better film. But as an idea to explore that concept and that character, it was just not as well executed as it could have been. And I just think those stories work and need to resonate more with audiences than perhaps Joker 2 has, to show that there is a way to keep doing those rather than falling back on the cookie cutter fare for people that they've got used to.
And if you need a superhero fix, next weekend is Auckland's big Armageddon Pop Culture Festival, where the Joker is always a top cosplay choice. Plus, the real-life Aquaman, Jason Momoa, will be there, along with Brenton Thwaites, who starred as Dick Grayson in DC's Titan series. And if we have to tell you who Dick Grayson's alter ego is, all hope is lost for you.
Where's Batman? Hey, little birdie's alone.
That's it for this week. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Alex Harmer and produced by Alexia Russell. Thanks to Neil Curtis and Darren Bevan. I'm Connor McClay, and
I'm Batman.